I love this because most of this is built like in our minds and we don't say this out loud. If we really thought about it long enough, there would be a part of us that just hoped or wished or believed that we could actually master the kind of thing that sits in our skull that is our heads. And it's actually really complex, right? I mean, you know this. Your mind is extremely complex. Your brain is extremely complex. And as much as we know about it, we also almost have an infinite amount of things that we don't know about it, right? Like the number of thoughts that you have per day and the number of like synapses and things that are happening in your brain constantly throughout the day, it's about 70,000 of those little things are going on constantly in your head. They did a study recently, and I love this. They were talking about the way that our mind works and the way that the connections happen. And we've discovered that if you were to take every cell phone on the planet, right, and make it happen, you could almost make that amount of data happen in your brain when it comes to how many synapses and moments that you have throughout the day. And it's all happening right here. You build entire worlds in your brain. Right? You build entire narratives about people in your brain. You build entire narratives about yourself in your brain. You experience everything that you experience through the ways that you think about the world and see the world. And it's so fascinating how it develops. Now, on the flip side of this, you have so many good things that happen with your brain, right? You experience really beautiful things and really extraordinary things, and some things that you can control. And then there are parts of your brain that sometimes feel like they're outside of your control as well. And it doesn't matter how smart you are, and it doesn't matter how good you are, it doesn't matter how athletic you are, or how many superpowers you might actually have. People in this room, right, if we were going to talk about it, there's a percentage of many of us, including me, that struggle to think about and process the world in a healthy way sometimes. And when we think about that long enough, it's kind of difficult to actually sort of grasp. Now, I want to show you a quick picture. Do not make fun of me, but we will do this together. This is me in, I believe, 7th grade. So this is like 12 to 13-year-old me. Nobody said, oh, I'm a little bit offended. I show up my kids, everybody's like, oh, I show a picture of me. They're like, why did he have buck teeth? I don't know, like... This is me in 7th grade. Now, I was actually, this is fun. I was, at the time, I was heading into 8th grade, so I was going to run for student council president. So, like, it was really fun. I loved that. I've never told this story publicly before. This is kind of fun. The way that I won the 8th grade student council presidency, are you ready? We had to film a video on a VHS. Let me back up. If you don't know what a VHS is, we had to film it, and then they played it on these little tiny TVs all throughout the school. And so I messed up in my talk, my little speech. And so what happened is they had to cut the VHS back. But to do that, you would rewind the VHS. You remember these days? And record over it. They didn't rewind it long enough. So I literally walk up to the stage. I stand there. I disappear. I re-walk up to the stage and reappear. And everyone voted for me. Thank you. I love that you clap for that. I love that you're like, oh, you cheated. Yay! It's great. So I did that. And so I was doing this. I actually, contrary to popular belief, I played sports. I was actually lettering in baseball in 8th grade. So I was playing varsity baseball. I started and played basketball and football. And I was relatively popular. We did like superlatives, and I won a few of those, which was kind of fun. And all this was happening, and I had friends, and a lot of people were looking at me going, like, oh, he's so happy. And then the other thing that was happening behind the scenes that nobody ever knew about was around this exact same time, I actually began to deeply struggle with my thoughts and my thought life. I started to have panic attacks as this 12, 13-year-old kid, and nobody ever knew it. Nobody ever knew that when I did my little disappearing act, and I like disappeared and came back. 20 minutes before that, I was like crouched in a school bathroom, which is never where you want to be crouched, crying, and I didn't know why. I had these panic attacks for a few years, and it would just happen over and over and over consistently. My mom knew about it. And then what happens is it just kind of followed me through like middle school on into high school, and then on into college, and it never quite went away. It was kind of like a dull sort of thing. You ever had like a dull pain that just never goes away? It was always there. I never really fully knew how to like navigate it, and I also always felt alone in my thoughts on it. So people didn't talk about it. People are talking about it a whole lot more now than they were 10, 15 years ago. And I'll never forget, I had one of my first jobs. I was working at a church in Atlanta. It was a really large church. We had these small group leaders. So I was working with middle school students. We had these small group leaders, and the internal narrative that I had for years was that this thing was going to be like my lid. Like whatever I struggled with when it came to my mind and mental health and my struggle, like that was going to be the thing that held me back. And so what I would do is we had a couple people that were small group leaders that were like really big executives in like the Fortune 500 world, right? They were a lot of large companies in Atlanta. A lot of these guys served with us. And so I'm this 22-ish, year old kid doing this. And I remember taking a CEO to lunch. And I sat down with him and we're talking. And he looks at me across the table. This is like our fourth or fifth time meeting. He looks at me across the table and he goes, "Hey, how are you doing really?" And what he didn't know is I'd had a panic attack earlier that day and I'd been struggling that week. And he goes, "How are you doing really?" And I gave him a great answer. You ever done this before? It was a phenomenal answer. It was so good. And it was absolutely bullcrap. And he looks at me across the table and he just smiles. This guy's like early 50s. He smiles, and I knew that he probably made that day what I was going to make in the next 2 years. I knew that he was extremely successful already. And he was incredibly wise and a phenomenal leader. And he looks at me across the table and he says, "Do you ever struggle with your thoughts, your mental health, and that sort of thing?" And I just broke. And I told him, and I love this. What he did is he leaned across the table and he just said, "Me too." And I was floored because successful people didn't do that, right? You didn't struggle with that. Or people who did really well in life, and they just mastered the mind and they were able to just, conjure up whatever it took to do the right thing. And he opens up over the next probably hour and a half about his struggle with some of this. And then he talks about other people that I would have never guessed that also struggled. And all of a sudden, this small bubble that was me was also other people who navigated life well. And so to kick off the next 3 weeks, I just want to tell you just for a second. Some of you, and I know this is just enough to know there's enough of us in the room, it's probably true. Some of you are struggling right now with some of the things that we're going to talk about. And today, it's going to hit you at times. You're like, "Oh, that's it." Some of you, you're not currently struggling with it, and you actually don't really know all that that's like, but you may struggle with it later, but you have somebody that you care about who is. And so today what we're going to do is we're going to start a conversation. It's really going to be a conversation this week and next week and the week after about your thoughts and how we navigate it, but also how do you love people who are walking that road in a healthy way. And so I want you to lean in. If you're here and you're a follower of Jesus, we're going to talk about it, certainly from a Christian perspective. And what I love is that the scripture talks about our thoughts and the way that we see the world in such a beautiful and compelling way. But also, if you're not a follower of Jesus, for the next few minutes, you're going to get the most, I think, one of the most clear pictures of what scripture talks about when it talks about our minds and how we interact with the world. But I would also say, if you're not a follower of Jesus, you're trying to figure out the faith thing. I'd also go I want you to look specifically at how practical scripture can actually be when it talks about things that matter the most, right? Now, to get us started, here's what I'm going to ask you to do, right? Just for a second, I'm not going to do anything weird. We're going to dim the lights just for a second. So we're going to dim the lights just for a second. I'm going to ask you to close your eyes. We're not going to do anything weird, but I'd love for you to close your eyes. And here's what I want you to think about just for a second. We're doing an exercise together. What are you thinking about right now? Right now in this moment, what are the things that you brought in here and you carried in here with you? So what are the things that you're thinking about? Some of you might be thinking about how little sleep you got last night. Some of you have kids. You're worried about something with your kids, and it's just kind of constantly in the background. Some of you are actually thinking about what we're talking about, and some of you haven't listened yet, and that's okay too. Some of you are thinking about your marriage and the things that you wish you could tweak or change, and that's kind of an ongoing thought that you have. Some of you, you're in the room and you're just deeply worried and you don't know why. You kind of feel a constant sense of being anxious about that. I want you to think about that for a second. Some of you are unhappy at your job and you're constantly carrying that, and that, no matter where you are, is something that you're thinking about. Some of you are extremely happy and you wish that it weren't dark in here so that you could kind of just be smiles and feel good, and that's great too. Some of you are here and you're really angry and you don't know why you're angry. I want you to think about that. Some of you are here and you know exactly why you're angry and you're sitting next to him. I want you to think about that as well. Some of you are scared and you're always scared and you don't know what you're afraid of. I want you to think about that. Let's bring the lights back up. Here's one of the most beautiful things, and this is where we're going to start in the entire series, is that you should celebrate the fact that you have the capacity to think and feel and experience the world. But beyond that, and this is where I really want all of us on the same page, that is beautiful and it's common with the human existence. What many people don't think about is that you also have the capacity to think about what you think. Now think about this for a second. Like, you are thinking whatever you're thinking constantly, right? Like, I was watching the Braves game last night, which they won, score. Y'all don't care, but I do. And I was thinking about how excited I was. It was 11:30 at night. I was at some point shouting and waking up our children. I was, all sorts of things. And then I got to think about the excitement that I was feeling, and I got to step outside of all that was happening and think about the thoughts that I was having. And this is a practice that we just don't do a lot. A lot of us don't do a lot, right? Many of us are so tethered to our phones that it's hard to think about the things that we're thinking about because we're scrolling on TikTok, and the only thing that we're thinking about is that funny guy on TikTok who interrupts everybody. You know what I mean? Like, there's a little bit, some of you are like, I know exactly who that is. Some of us are so tethered to the things that we're worried about that we don't step outside of the things that we worry about to think about the fact that we get to think about the things that we're worried about. And it's so important for us to think about our thoughts because your thoughts will matter because your thoughts move you, and they're constantly moving you. They're moving every part of your life, right? Your thoughts are moving your emotions, right? The way you see the world and you think about things, it's moving your emotions constantly. Right? Some of you, and you know this, you can tweak the way you feel by thinking about whatever it is that you're thinking about differently. Right? I got cut off the other day, and I don't have road rage, I promise. But I was a little frustrated with the guy that did. And then a few minutes later, I'm sitting at a red light, and I see a picture of my kid from 4 years ago when he was like 1. And I got all of a sudden just so happy all over again, and I thought about things so differently. And it was only because I saw a picture of my kid. And I started thinking about things so differently for the rest of the day. It was a tiny shift. I didn't even mean to do it, but my emotions were so tethered to the way that I thought about things. It's also tethered to your actions, and you know this. The way that you think about things affects the way that you act. If you don't believe me, think about your relationships that you have with your spouse or your boyfriend or girlfriend, whoever. Like, think about your relationships with the people that are closest to you. The way you think about them, but also the way you think about the world affects the way that you act towards people. Be really honest. Ladies in the room, how many of you ever looked at your man and said, you need to go take a walk? Anybody ever done that? Fellas, how many of you actually taken that walk? You know what I mean? Like, you get it. There's something about like it's affecting your actions, and simply stepping outside to see things differently affects the way that you act. But more importantly, and this is where we're going to focus a little bit of our time, it also greatly affects your future. The life that you're wanting to build is actually going to be built by the way that you think today and the way that you process the world today. And so the deeper question for us to really consider is, what direction are your thoughts actually taking you? Which way are they moving you? How is it moving you through the world? How is it moving you through your emotions and your actions and ultimately your future? Now, the scripture talks about this quite a bit. In fact, the way that the writers of the New Testament in particular talk about this is if they assume that you could zoom out from some of that and see the world in a different way. Right? There's a guy named Paul who wrote about half the New Testament. He's a brilliant guy. If you've not read any of his writings, it's extraordinary. He essentially, he was not a follower of Jesus, became a follower of Jesus, ended up really in an exponential way. The church grew because of some of the things that Paul did all over the world. He sort of franchised a local church in the Roman context and all sorts of other places. It exploded, and Paul was specifically focused on people who were non-Jewish in some ways. And he was brilliant. Most scholars would say that he spoke multiple languages. He was extraordinarily educated, and he would write these letters to groups of people in these churches all over the world about how to live and how to think about the world and how to interact with the world in it. Now, in one of the places, he would have people where he would go and show up and teach, and then other people would come behind him and try to discredit the things that he said or that he taught about. I mean, it was really like a Twitter battle in ancient Rome. Like it was that kind of thing happening in really fun ways. And then Paul would write these letters, and I love the way they'd be read. Somebody would stand up, no microphone, and just read Paul's letters to all these people, and everybody would just kind of lean in and listen. And so in one of these controversies where somebody was teaching something that was against what Paul taught, Paul writes this letter, and he starts talking about this sort of feud. And in the midst of all of this, weird theological feud with this ancient sort of church in Corinth, he begins to write about what it looks like to think about your thoughts and navigate your thought life. And he talks about it in sort of this militaristic sort of way, right? And the way that he talks about it is probably even a little bit uncomfortable for us in 2021. He talks about it in this military, very forceful, slightly violent sort of way, because I think he's trying to make a really hard point about how important it is that we think about our thoughts in this way. And so we're looking at 2 Corinthians, we in chapter 10. Here's what Paul says. He says, "For though we live in the world, we do not wage war as the world does." And he's talking about our desires and our appetites and the things that we find ourselves prone to. He's like, we don't approach the world the way that other people do. And then he says this. He says, "The weapons we fight with are not even weapons of the world." Essentially, he's saying, I want to take you out of the whole sort of cosmos that you sort of live in, and I want you to think about the entire thing in sort of one kind of brushstroke. Think about it differently than everybody else does. We don't respond or act or think about things the way that everybody else does. We're countercultural in that way. He says this, on the contrary, he says they have, the ways that he approaches it, or the weapons that he's about to talk about, have divine power to demolish strongholds. Now, you don't talk about demolishing strongholds very often, I don't think. It's not great date night conversation. You just don't do that. What he's talking about are the things in your mind and in my mind that just kind of grip us in our minds and in our hearts. It's the narratives that you kind of assume but don't know that you're assuming. It's the thought patterns that are kind of consistent with the way that you think and approach things. And he says this, the way that you combat that, there's actually this divine power or nature to break those thought patterns that are going on in your life. He goes on and he says this. He says, we demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God or the way that God has designed us to be and live in the world. Then he says, we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. Now, the New Testament, particularly what Paul's writing, was written not in English but in Greek. And the imagery here is actually pretty violent. It's not just we just grabbed hold of it and pulled it over here. It's this forceful, sort of almost violent way of grabbing the thing and owning it and taking it captive and making it yours. The divine power that he's talking about is that there's something moving through you and through me and this power that we have access to that allows us to grab hold of the thoughts and the thought patterns and the rhythms of being that move us away from God's best in our lives. And he says our responsibility is to think about it in a way where we take that captive and take hold of it. Now, for us, I think this matters so much because your thoughts will matter because your thoughts move every part of you. And the way that many of us live, including me oftentimes, is we live as if we're powerless to take captive some of the thoughts and thought patterns and rhythms that make their way into our ways of being. And so this other place that Paul writes is to another church in Rome, and he's writing to these early Christians, talking about how it is to live and what it means to live in this new way or this new kingdom of the world. And if you've grown up in church or around church, you've probably heard the second part of this verse, but the first part is actually, I think, even more interesting than the second part. He's talking about the ways that you sort of take captive or zoom outside and take these thoughts captive. Here's what he says. It's Romans chapter 12, verse 1. He says, therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, he says, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, to offer the things about you that are tangible as this living, breathing sacrifice to God. Like open-handedly, here's all of me. Holy and pleasing to God, or set apart and pleasing to God. And this is your true and proper worship, right? Not just singing, yay for singing, but more than that. That actual worship to God is saying, here's like all of me. Here's my mind, here's my body, here's my soul, here's every bit of it. And then he goes directly for the mind in the next verse. He says, so do not conform any longer to the patterns of this world, or don't be wrapped up in the other patterns of people who don't process it like this, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And the way that renewal is talked about in the New Testament, I love this so much. It's not just a one-time and then you're done. It's this constant sort of renewal of your mind and your body and your thoughts and your approach to a life that's whole. And he said, you have the opportunity to be transformed by that consistent, practical renewing of your mind. Now, I've never done CrossFit, but I've done P90X. Some of you are like, well, we can understand why. That hurt, but yeah. I did P90X, I did P2X, but that's fine. I did 2 days of it, and by that I mean I did about half the workout, right? Like, you do the bar thing, all that. And I thought about that. I thought it's so funny. I love people who do CrossFit. I think it's so interesting because it's like a community of people who are focused on a thing and they get after it. And there's like Instagram pictures and they all look much more ripped than I am. And I'm a little bit jealous, but I don't want to go. Yeah. And so I love this because there's this focus on like physical health, right? I went to Whole Foods the other day. Anybody ever been to Whole Foods? Have you ever been there? And I bought a pizza, but that's different. And I showed up to Whole Foods and I was like, there's these people and there's a lot of people there and they're so focused on like, there's this like organic thing. And I think that's so great. And they're fixing all these things. I feel guilty because I'm sitting there with like, I have a pizza. I think it's organic, but I don't know. There's cheese and I put Velveeta on top of it, but that's fine. And there's this deep focus on health, and many of us are good at that. And then there's a part of us that we think about like success, and we think about work, and we think about job, and we think about training. In fact, you train all throughout school, and then you go pay somebody else to train you more in college to be good at the things that you feel like you should do with your life and your career. We spend so much time and energy and space on that. You get married and many people go to premarital counseling and you're focused on how to be a good wife or husband and you're navigating those kinds of things. How much training do we actually allow ourselves to receive in just how to think in a healthy and renewal, like a positive renewal type way? We miss that. One of the biggest critiques of, I think, Christianity, which is valid, is that when you look at people who call themselves Christians, they miss this thing so much. Like some of the healthiest people you know aren't Christians. Why? Because God asks us as followers of Jesus to offer the fullness of ourselves, all of ourselves, as living, holy, sacred sacrifices to Him, including our minds and the way that we think. And then Paul gives us like promise at the end of it. Like if you do this thing, if you do not conform any longer to the patterns of this world, but you're transformed by this renewal of your mind, he says, then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, His good, His pleasing, His perfect will. Then you will know. Then you will know what it is to live in this kingdom that's countercultural and different than the world. Then you will know what it's like to not feel like you have to respond to that Facebook comment from that uncle. Then you will know what it's like to experience pain and suffering and also know what it is to navigate pain and suffering in a healthy and submissive sort of way to God. Then you will know what it's like to be a good husband and a good father. Then you will know what it's like not to just be successful, but to have the character that will sustain that success as you move through your life. Then you will know what it's like to be a wise old man who sits on the front porch with a pipe and says, "Here's what you should do, my son." I don't know why I turned into Gandalf, but you get it. Then you will know what it is to live in the kingdom in the way that Jesus intended us to live. And so before we take a deep dive next week, which we're going to do into your mental health, kind of a deeper journey than that, before we even talk about how you come alongside of other people that you love that are struggling, the first thing you have to own is your own mind and your own thought life. No one else can own it. And the second part of that is most people will never know if you do it or not. But you will. When it's quiet and when the lights dim and it's just you and your thoughts, you'll know. Are you processing and renewing your mind in a healthy way? And are you able to live in the way that Jesus has called you with freedom, without the bondage of those rhythms or narratives that weren't meant to attach themselves to your mind and your heart? Do you know what it is to be free of those kind of things? Put in my notes to say it this way: our thoughts move, our lives move in the direction of our thoughts. And so what I want you to focus so much on, especially for 1 week, is to be a person who thinks about your thoughts, right? So here's kind of the 3 steps. And this is what I love to tell people this. You can remember this. We'll post this online. You'll see this on Instagram or whatever. You can take a picture of it. There's a big enough screen for you to see that. However you want to do it. But I want you to focus on these 3 things. So if you want to take notes, or if you want to take a picture of it, if you want to write it down or just look at it on Instagram later, that's great. But I want you for 1 week, follow Jesus or not, to focus on these 3 parts. Think about your thoughts. The first thing is this: I want you to be an observer of your thoughts. As you're thinking, I want you to also be a person who is critiquing those thoughts. Is this a healthy thought? That person walks in and you think about whatever it is that you're thinking about, is that a healthy way to think about them? I don't know. You should think about it. Some of you need to buy a journal for the first time in your life, not just do a notes app thing, even though that's great. You need to buy a journal and write down, today, these are the things that I thought about, and these things felt unhealthy, these things felt healthy. How do I navigate those things? You need to be an observer of your thoughts. The people that you admire the most are likely already doing this, either consciously or subconsciously. You need to be an observer of your thoughts. Second thing is this: I want you to be a gatekeeper of your thoughts, right? This is next level kind of stuff, right? I want you to go, I've thought the thing and I observed the thing, but I'm not going to think about the thing anymore. And decide that you're not. And then think about something else. To redirect and reshape the way that you think. I want you to be an observer of it. These are the thoughts that are coming through. You can't always tweak that. You're going to think the things that you think about consciously or subconsciously. They're going to come through you. The next step of you is go, okay, I'm going to be a gatekeeper of it though. I'm not going to let just every thought come in and think about it. This thought's going to come in and we're no, you shall not pass. That's 2 Lord of the Rings references. Some of you cheer. That's amazing. I've seen them all 49 hours. Anyway, be a gatekeeper, say, no, I'm not going to think about that. Or, and this is the other one. This is one that we're probably not good at. A thought comes in that probably feels uncomfortable, but is good. And you go, I'm going to open the door to that thought and let it take root in my mind and in my heart. You're going to be a gatekeeper because you're observing it and you're deciding what's going to come in and not. And then the third thing is this, and this is a big one for us. I want us to reframe the toxic thoughts towards healthy thinking. Here's what I mean. Some of you are deeply insecure and nobody knows it. So when you think a toxic thought about yourself or a thought that's not true about yourself, what I want you to do is actually approach it like Paul does. Because it matters. I want you to wage war against that thought. I want you in your mind not to go, I probably shouldn't think that. I want you to go, no, I'm not going to think that. You know what I mean? I'm not, and you're going to really, I want it to make you angry. I want you to go, no. I'm not that thing. I am this thing. For some of you, you've accepted labels that somebody gave you when you were like 4 years old. Your dad looked at you and did this, and you accept a label like, I'm not pretty, or for me, it was like, I'm not good at math. I still do this. Ryan pulls out a spreadsheet. I'm like, I don't even want to touch it. I don't want to look at it. Like, I get nervous. How many numbers are, like there's a little bit of that. Like, there are all sorts of labels that you think about. I want you to go, it's not that. No, I'm actually this. Some of you, when it comes to finances, you've just assumed for so many years that you're bad at it. And you don't want to dive into it, so you just let that assumption move you through the course of your life, and it's just taking you all the way in to you not ever being able to get great at it. You just got to reframe those thoughts and go, you know what? I have been bad at it before. And now I'm going to reshape and rethink and approach it differently because I can. Some of you, come on, we'll do this with dads. Many dads that I talk to never feel like they're a great dad, no matter where they're at. They're just like, I never really feel like I'm, whatever. And your kids don't think that. Your wife doesn't think that. They've all told you opposite. And you always live with this insecure, I'm just never good. And I do this. I feel this all the time. I look at it like, no. When those thoughts come in, you got to like reshape them and go, no, I want to remind myself of this. Ryan has been quoting this, what's the book, The Power of Habit? Is that Duhigg? Yeah. I love this. We're working on this even in our house right now. We're going like, I may not have got it successful or perfect in the past, but I'm the kind of person who, and then you fill in the blank with the kind of person who you are or could be or should be. And it just reframes the whole thought in a new direction. I don't think, this is me, it's not like prosperity sort of thing. It's not that you just like dream up things, all of a sudden they show up. But I believe this deeply, that you reframe things and see the world differently and respond differently, and your life does shift. But it's a discipline, and it causes you to focus in on that. So here's the three things I want you to focus on. Be an observer on your thoughts, be a gatekeeper of your thoughts, and I want you to focus on reframing your thoughts consistently.